Thank you all for coming. We are really excited about this project and getting your feedback today. So this is joint work with your colleague in the Glenn School, Stéphane Lavertu, Vlad Logan in political science, and we're also fortunate enough to have two of the RAs who worked on the project here today, Corey and Ray. So we're really excited. Okay. So this is a new project for us. We've done a lot of analysis, and we really are thinking through how we want to frame this to appeal to a general audience, get a lot of people interested in it. So fundamentally, this is a project about direct democracy. Okay? So what are we talking about when we talk about direct democracy in this context? Well, we're thinking about it in the way that it's most commonly used in the contemporary United States. Okay? So what we're thinking of is situations where voters are presented with a binary option. They can approve something and implement a proposal, or they can reject it and get the reversion outcome or the status quo. Okay? So this is going to be important for kind of how we think about the consequences of direct democracy. So just kind of be clear, this is not direct democracy in the style of a New England town meeting, a town meeting in a Swiss canton, things like that. What's going to be important here is that we have a binary proposal that voters can reject or accept. Okay? So most of the research on direct democracy, the empirical research, is really comparing different systems of government and their effect on a bunch of different policy outcomes. Okay, so kind of the modal empirical study in this literature is examining differences along a bunch of different dimensions of policy outcomes between direct democracy and representative democracy. Okay, so that's not what we're going to be doing today. Today, we're really going to be focusing on the consequences of direct democracy and how the mechanics, the mechanisms of direct democracy work, how they affect policy outcomes. Okay, so kind of the important jumping off point for our study today is about how this binary nature of direct democracy induces policy uncertainty on what governments actually do. Okay, so because direct democracy is binary in the way we're thinking about it, essentially what it's doing is it's inducing a lottery, some uncertainty over whether the government implements the proposal or the reversion. Okay? So this is something that's been really important in theoretical analyses of direct democracy. So kind of the second generation of theoretical work on direct democracy realized that policy uncertainty is important. Voters reject proposals. Okay, it's not the case that all proposals get passed. And researchers have analyzed kind of the theoretical implications for how this uncertainty affects the proposals that agenda setters implement, what happens in equilibrium, things like that. Okay? So as I mentioned earlier, most of the empirical work doesn't really look at the uncertainty effects of it. Instead, it focuses on the differences between representative and direct democracy. Okay? So the important thing that we're going to be doing is looking at how that uncertainty affects policy outcomes. Okay? How quickly are political jurisdictions able to adjust the policy outcomes that they have when voters reject the proposal and implement the reversion rule. Okay. So really what we're going to be looking at is how quantitatively important is this uncertainty about how voters behave for policy outcomes? Okay. What are the short-run and long-term consequences? Okay. How quickly can political jurisdictions adjust when their proposals get voted down by the constituents? Okay, so the setting that we're going to be talking about is education politics, specifically in Ohio. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the dynamic regression discontinuity design to estimate the causal effects of voters rejecting one of these direct democracy proposals, tax referenda, on a bunch of different outcomes of interest relating around expenditure, revenues, expenditures, and then in our education context, student achievement outcomes. Okay, so the setting, as I've just alluded to, is one where the institutions of direct democracy in the United States are very prevalent, and that's education politics. Okay, so lots and lots of localities all around the country, they use direct democratic institutions like the referenda, or in some cases the initiative, to determine the level of public financing of education. Okay? So the amount that goes into the operating budget in some states, this is really important for capital expenditures, things like that. Okay? And we're going to specifically look at how rejection of these levy proposals, of these tax referenda, affects revenues, okay, from the locality, from other political jurisdictions like the state and federal government, Then expenditures, okay, so to determine whether these revenue effects have a binding effect on how districts actually spend their money. And then down the line, we'll actually look at some student achievement outcomes and see how failure of these tax referenda affects student outcomes. Okay, so all of our data are going to be from Ohio, not surprisingly. So Ohio is an interesting state to look at for a couple of reasons. One is that we have access to really rich data about how districts are raising money, the revenue that they have, how they're spending it along a bunch of different categories, dimensions of expenditures. Okay? And we also have nice data on student achievement and things like staff personnel that we can talk about to try to explain what's going on with student achievement. Okay? So the big kind of thing to keep in mind is that there's a trade-off in terms of the richness of the data we have and the potential external validity of it. So there's some things that are different about Ohio that might not apply to other states. But by focusing on one state, we really have nice data and can exploit a lot of different things to study the effects of direct democracy and how it actually works. Okay. All right, so the first thing I just want to talk about before getting into the main research design is to kind of give you an idea for how important uncertainty about how voters are going to behave is for determining what happens in these elections. Okay, so this is a histogram of the percentage of voters voting yes on a particular levy proposal. Okay, so in our data, there are about 3,300 different levy proposals that voters are presented with. And this histogram shows the percentage voting yes on each of these elections. So the really important thing to keep in mind here is that a lot of these levy proposals are being rejected. Okay, so the important thing is that for a levy proposal to pass, it needs a strict majority of votes, more than 50% plus one. And as you can see in this histogram, lots and lots of the levies are getting rejected. Okay, so about 48% of the levies in our sample, voters are rejecting. Okay? So we're not in a world where there's complete information about how the voters are going to behave and that the school districts implement these levy proposals in a way that they're always going to get passed. Okay? So uncertainty about voter behavior is really important in determining whether these are passed or not. Yes?
So the same district could be in here multiple times?
Yes. Yeah. So and that is happening in almost all cases. So there are about a little more than 600 districts in Ohio and more than 3,000 proposals in it. So one reason why we focus on Ohio is that Ohio is kind of particularly dependent on these local tax referenda for financing compared to other states. So they have to go to the voters at pretty regular intervals and ask them for permission to raise rates. Yes?
Is there variation between urban and more rural school districts? It passes more, there's more levies passing than in rural? Or?
Yeah. So have we ever looked at that specifically? Yeah. So kind of everything today is going to be pretty homogeneous and assume that the treatment effects are constant. I think the natural next step is to look at differences across types of districts. I would guess that larger, more urban districts are more reliant on this kind of finding. So one thing about Ohio is that if you're below a certain tax rate, you don't need to go to the voters. Yeah, if I had to guess, I would guess that the more urban districts are passing more of these. But, however, the larger, more urban districts are a smaller portion of total school districts in Ohio. Okay, other questions? Yes?
Did you lump together all levies, including emergency levies, operating levies, renewal levies, capital levies, permanent improvement levies?
Yep. So for this, we've lumped together a bunch of different types of levies. We have data on that exact kind of coarse categorization of the levies across different types. We haven't really looked at it in terms of breaking up the treatment effects across types of levies. Yeah. Yes?
And what's the period of time? How far back?
Yep. So this is going from 2000 to 2012. Okay. So lots of school districts, lots of elections, and lots of them are failing. Okay. So in lots of cases, the voters reject what the school districts have proposed to them. Okay. Okay. All right. So to examine the effects of levy failure on different policy outcomes, we're going to estimate a regression discontinuity design to recover that causal effect. Okay? So how is this going to work? Well, in our setting, treatment status, whether the levy fails or not, is a deterministic function of that realization of the vote share. Okay? So if as vote share goes from just a little bit less to 50% to just a little bit more to 50%, treatment status, levy failure, goes from 1 to 0. Okay? And how we're going to do this is we're going to regress our outcomes of interest, those are revenue, expenditure, and student achievement outcomes that I talked about earlier, on an indicator for levy failure, okay, whether the levy received fewer than 50% of the vote or not. And then a cubic polynomial of vote percentage. Okay? So we've done some robustness checks looking at different ways of specifying this polynomial. We can talk about that in the Q&A. Everything in the paper that we circulated uses a cubic polynomial for vote percentage. Okay, so the key identifying assumption, how we're going to use this regression discontinuity to recover the causal effect of levy failure on our outcomes of interest, is that in a neighborhood of 50%, the realization of vote share approximates a randomized experiment. Okay, so kind of the key thing here is that school districts can't precisely manipulate how much vote share the levy proposal gets in this neighborhood around 50%. Okay? So we're just going to be able to use that discontinuity. How does the outcome of interest jump when you move from just a little bit more to 50% to less than 50%? Okay? And then to incorporate all the other data that we have for elections that aren't close to this threshold, we're just going to use this polynomial to model the conditional mean of our outcomes of interest. Okay. All right, so that's the general idea of regression discontinuity in a cross-section. So here, we're actually going to use, so I'll have some cross-sectional results and some more dynamic results that look at how the effects vary over time. Okay, so what's really interesting about this direct democracy setting that we're in here is not what happens contemporaneously with the election, not what happens in the year after, but what are kind of the long-run effects of levy failure or levy passage. Okay, so we have treatments whose effect is potentially varying over time. Okay, so the effect might be different 1 year after the election compared to 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. Okay, and we also have potentially multiple treatments. Okay, so the entire history of levy failure and passage determines these policy outcomes. Okay, so what we actually have here is a panel. Okay, we don't just have a cross-section of districts at a particular point in time. We actually have a panel of the entire history of levy outcomes, vote percentages, and then the policy outcomes that we're interested in. Okay, so kind of the main results that we'll be focusing on for the most part in the talk and in the paper actually fully exploit the panel nature of these data. Okay, so we're going to use a research design developed by Cellini, Ferreira, and Rothstein, the Quarterly Journal of Economics a few years ago, to study the effects of bond measures on local real estate markets. Okay, in our setting. Okay, to look at the effect of levy failure on these different outcomes about local school districts. Okay, so the way this is going to work is essentially we're going to have a panel. We're going to construct these mini panels of each proposal. Okay, so every time a proposal shows up on the ballot, we're going to construct a panel of outcomes in years 2 and 1 year before the election, the year of the election, and then up to 6 years after the election. We're going to stack all these things, all of these proposal panels, into a unified regression. And we're going to include fixed effects for each proposal, each calendar year, and each year relative to the year that the proposal was implemented. Okay, so we're kind of fully exploiting, we're able to kind of control in a pretty rich way for unobserved heterogeneity across proposals, across time, across districts. Okay, so one important thing to keep in mind is that those proposal fixed effects, they're going to subsume district fixed effects. Okay, so our analysis is going to account in a really general way for unobserved differences across districts. Okay. All right. So that's kind of the general identification strategy, the way that we're going to determine how levy failure affects these different policy outcomes. All right. So before getting into the main results and what we find, it's really important to see that it's actually valid and appropriate to use a regression discontinuity design in our setting. Okay? So we know we have a treatment that jumps discontinuously at this 50% vote threshold. Okay? But just because that's the case, it's not clear that we necessarily have something that approximates a randomized experiment. Okay? So there are a couple of ways in which this could all go horribly wrong. One way is if school districts or somebody else in the Secretary of State's office, something like that, have really precise control over the realization of vote share. Okay? So, for example, if very competent, ambitious superintendents can somehow control or manipulate the realization of vote share around this threshold, we're not going to have something that looks like a randomized experiment. Okay? Instead, what's going to happen is we're going to have systematic differences in the competence or ambition of superintendents to the left and the right of the threshold. Okay? So we would mistakenly infer that our treatment effects are actually effects of levy failure itself, but they're actually contaminated by, co-varies with this unobserved feature of the school districts. Okay? The superintendent in that kind of toy example. Okay. So we're going to kind of do two validity tests to see whether this is going on before we present the main results. Okay? So the first test is a density-based test developed by Justin McCrary to look at whether the density of the running variable, vote percentage in our application, changes discontinuously at 50%. Okay? So if it's possible for superintendents, some other people in the school districts to manipulate vote share, what we might see is that the density of vote share is going to be higher to the right of 50% than it is to the left of 50%. Okay? So that's going to be our first validity test. The second one is going to be a balance test, familiar to anyone who's done a laboratory experiment. Okay? We're going to see whether randomization actually works. We're going to see if all of these baseline characteristics of the district, whether they change discontinuously at the 50% vote threshold. Okay. All right. So if there's kind of that imbalance, we might think that something has gone horribly wrong in the randomization. Okay? It would be incorrect to interpret our results as an experiment. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so the way we're going to do this is first going to use the density-based test developed by McCrary. Essentially how this is going to work is we're going to estimate the density of vote percentage, the running variable in our case, to the left of the 50% threshold and to the right of the 50% threshold, and then see if there's a statistically significant difference. And then the balance tests, the way these are going to work is we're going to regress a bunch of district characteristics. So some of the dependent variables that we talk about, other characteristics that we have about the district, like enrollment, things like that, in the year of the proposal, and see if it is imbalanced along the realization of vote share. Okay. So the first test is the McCrary test, and as you can see in the graph, there's really no evidence whatsoever that the density of the running variable of the vote percentage changes around 50%. Okay? So it's pretty smooth. It's this unimodal distribution, so each dot is kind of a local average, and then the dark black line is the density, and then the lighter lines are the 95% confidence intervals. Okay? Yes? So each dot is kind of the local average of just dots for the height.
But it is an average taken over the time period or
over the whole time period. Yep. So it's kind of what percentage of the observations of the levy proposals fall into each of these bins of vote percentage.
so the unit of analysis is the district.
The unit of analysis is a levy proposal. So a district could show up in here multiple times. It could show up in here 0 times. That's pretty rare. But so for each levy proposal, so there were about 3,300 levy proposals in our data set. For each of these, we have the realized vote percentage. Okay? And then these dots are just showing kind of the local average of each of these things. Yeah?
This is a question for later.
Mhm.
Do you worry about spatial effects? The fact that
Mhm.
you're in Columbus and Southwestern School District has multiple levies.
Mm-hmm.
Media market and maybe effective by.
Yeah. So in terms of, I think that would have, so in terms of kind of the experiments, what if everything is working properly is that on average, kind of everything else is the same, just to the left of the threshold and just to the right of the threshold. But you're exactly right in terms of interpreting the results. Is this just a effect that's entirely individual to the district, or is what's going on in other districts affecting things? Yeah. So there's actually an paper just published in the Journal of Public Economics using similar data to these, and actually a broader set of kind of tax elections. And the author finds that kind of these spatial spillovers aren't actually that important for a bunch of different tax outcomes. Yeah, I don't know if that how directly that applies to our setting, but it's kind of interesting to think about. Yeah.
So the fact that in Ohio over 80% of renewal levies pass, and only about 20 to 25% of brand new operating levies pass, the fact that no new taxes, capital levies pass overwhelmingly, permanent improvement levies pass overwhelmingly, that doesn't mess up your.
Yes.
If you bundle them all together,
yeah. So it messes up the treatment effect. So what we're going to get at the end of the day is an average treatment effect across all of those different types. Kind of because of the randomization and the regression discontinuity, the proportion of capital levies and the to the left of the threshold and to the right of the threshold should be balanced as a result of the randomization. But yeah, you're right. So the treatment effects might be different, and we can't really speak to that. What we can do is, and we haven't done this yet, is kind of disaggregate the analysis across those different types of levy elections. Yeah, and I think that's kind of one of the next steps that we should be doing. Okay, other questions? Okay, so first takeaway, not really any strong evidence of manipulation. Seems encouraging that we can actually estimate the regression discontinuity and interpret it as a causal effect. Okay, so the next kind of validity test is going to be a balance test. So here we have 53 different characteristics of districts, like their enrollments in different grades, some of the outcomes, et cetera. And we look at whether they change discontinuously around realized vote percentage in the year of levy proposal. Okay? So this is really an experiment in the baseline year, the year that the proposal shows up on the ballot or not. The realized vote percentage on these levy elections can't have any effect on these baseline characteristics. Okay? And that's basically what we find. Okay? So we estimate 53 separate regressions, take the p-values for each of these regressions, and the density of those p-values kind of closely approximate what you would expect under the null hypothesis of no effect. Okay? So the first, to the left panel, we have a histogram of the p-values. To the right panel, on the right side, we have a hanging rootogram of the p-values. And the hanging rootogram really shows kind of deviations from what's expected, and there really aren't any. Okay? So the only place that there are is there's a little more probability density toward the middle, p-values between 0.4 and 0.6, but really no evidence that the p-values are what you would expect if the baseline characteristics were in balance. Okay? So this kind of just illustrate that in our particular setting, which might not be true in other settings where you have elections and determining policy outcomes, okay, we have something that looks like an experiment, okay, and we can interpret our results as causal effects. Okay. So with those preliminaries, I want to start getting to the results. Okay, so the first set of results I'm going to show are graphical results about how local revenue changes as a function of levy failure and the realized percentage of the vote. Okay, so these are going to be pretty imprecisely estimated. After I go through these graphical results, I'll spend most of the time talking about the panel results that kind of explicitly take account of the panel nature of the data. So this is the Cellini, Ferrero, and Rolfstein estimator. Okay? Before going into that, I just want to show 6 pictures. Okay? So each of these pictures shows local property tax revenue and how it changes as a function of vote share. Okay? So the really important thing for us is how does it change? What's the jump? What's the discontinuity at that 50% threshold? Okay? So the dots are local averages. The fits are they're quadratic fits of those local averages, and the lighter lines are the confidence intervals. Okay? So what we see here is an important, but not very precisely estimated, jump in local property tax revenue as you go from passage to failure. Okay? So your local property tax revenue, kind of unsurprisingly, goes down in a meaningful way when a levy fails. Okay? And then kind of getting at the dynamics, we can just repeat the same cross-sectional exercise in year 2 after election, year 3, year 4, year 5, and year 6, okay, and see how long-lived the effects are. Okay? So year 2, pretty similar story in terms of the discontinuity. Okay? Failing is costly in terms of local revenue. Year 3, pretty similar. Year 4, same idea. Confidence intervals are getting pretty big. We're losing some data. And then starting around year 5, okay, the districts where the levy failed are starting to catch up to those where it passed. Okay? So by years 5 and year 6, there's no real difference between those districts where the levy initially failed and those where it passed. Okay? So this is kind of getting at one of the key research questions in this paper is how long-lived are these effects of failure? Okay? Yes?
Sorry, just to clarify, so these aren't capturing, these are just from that baseline?
Exactly.
If they pass it 2 years out, that's not captured here, but it might be captured by the fact that they're catching it.
Exactly. So that's exactly right, and you're way ahead of the game, and that's going to be the important mechanism that's going on. So what's different about what's changing over time that's allowing these districts to catch up? It's that they have future access to the ballot box. Okay, so in a few slides, I'll actually show that. So the important thing to keep in mind here is the x-axis is the realized vote percentage in the year of the initial election. Okay, and then we're looking at how the revenue changes over time. Yes.
Something about quadratic, but then earlier what you said about
yeah, so for these graphs, these are quadratic. For the effects I'm just about to show, it's cubic. It doesn't really, for the things I'm about to show, it doesn't really matter if you use quadratic or cubic. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's how are you going to use that information in the tails to say something about that discontinuity near the threshold. Yeah. So for the results I'm about to show, the dynamic results is going to be a cubic polynomial. We've done everything from linear to quintic. The substantive story I'm about to tell is going to be pretty similar.
Do you look at all, so that focuses on the first moment. Have you tried to use
higher order moments?
Yeah. Maybe the sort of risk.
Yeah, actually, that's a good idea. So that's right. So from a voter's perspective, you don't just care about the conditional mean, you care about the variance of these policy outcomes. Actually, and kind of for the framing I'm thinking about for this, that's something that's substantively important, is how variable are the future policy outcomes. That's a great idea. Thank you. So we haven't done that yet. Okay. Other questions? Okay. All right. So now let's get into the results that fully use the panel nature of the data. Okay. And this is using the Cellini, Ferreira, and Rothstein estimator to look at how local revenue is changing, okay, over time. Okay. And these are more precisely estimated. These are 95% confidence intervals. And the dot is a coefficient estimate from our regression. Okay. And what you see is a story that, in terms of the means, is substantively similar to what you see in the graphical story. Okay, so in year 1, after a levy fails, there's about a $200 loss in local property tax revenue compared to districts where the levy passes. Okay. In year 2, pretty similar effects. Okay. By year 3, the point estimate is still about negative 100, but it's no longer statistically distinguishable from 0. By year 4, it's getting pretty close to 0. Year 5 and year 6, same story. Okay. So, yep. So this is kind of basically same idea as those cross-sectional results, but kind of using this richer estimation method to get there. Okay. So, kind of what are the consequences of this for a district? So we show this effect on local revenue. Okay. Kind of one thing to think about that's important for political scientists who think about federalism and intergovernmental relations is just because you have this effect for local revenue doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have it for total revenue. Okay, so one mechanism that we kind of have in mind is intergovernmental transfers from the state and federal governments. Okay, so it could be the case that direct democracy induces uncertainty over local revenue, but federal and state governments in a federation can kind of have revenue sharing that eliminates some of that uncertainty. Okay, so that's not what we find. Okay, so we see that there's really no evidence of the state compensating districts for levy failure. Okay, so actually, in the years immediately after passage, if anything, state revenue goes down. It's not very. We really can't distinguish it from zero. Okay. Similar for federal revenue, so these treatment effects are really small, really close to zero, and there's really no evidence at all of offsetting transfers. Okay, so if we aggregate, if we were to aggregate this up to total revenue, the effects, if anything, they just get a little bigger when you look at total revenue. Yes.
The federal money in terms of matches.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so kind of the structure of the federal transfers doesn't allow this kind of insurance against failure. Yes?
So you can identify which particular school or districts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As a political science, would you want to know something about the politics of that?
Yeah, so that's right. Yeah, that's right. So I think kind of something that we're interested in the future is kind of how does variation in the local political institutions and, say, the strength of labor unions in local politics affect these treatment effects. The problem, of course, is that our identification isn't as good. So there could be lots of other reasons why school educational unions are more invested in the political project. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, so, yeah, just kind of local left-right political preferences. Yeah, that's great. Do you have a hypothesis for what might, conjecture for what might happen?
That price slide, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you've thrown it all into that one.
Yep.
Right, so at least
Mm-hmm.
might allow you to, sorry, no, not that one, this is the state.
The state revenue.
Right, that one.
Yeah.
You may get some movement there.
Okay. Thank you. Yes.
The problem with this slide, though, is that because in recent times most of the levies have been capital levies,
Mhm.
you get state matching money, or if you may get 90. If you pass the levy, you get 90% of your building from the state.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't pass it, obviously you get nothing from the state.
Right.
So there should be enormous state revenues going to the successful capital
Mhm.
levies, if you're talking about building new facilities, and no state money going if you fail.
Do you know if that goes into the capital account or? Yeah. So I wonder in terms of how these things are defined, whether those type of state transfers are showing up in the way we've defined the variable. I just really don't know. So we need to look into that. Thank you. Okay. All right. So no evidence of intergovernmental transfers to smooth out this uncertainty. Okay. So kind of the question about the revenue effects that this kind of arrives at is what's the mechanism for how districts are able to catch up? And we're going to point to kind of future access to the ballot. Okay, so when you fail, when a tax referendum fails, it's not the case that you're stuck with that forever. The school districts can go back to the ballot, and the voters have the opportunity to approve or reject it in the future. Okay, so we kind of find that this is exactly what's going on. So what this slide is showing is those same treatment effects, but now our outcome is whether a levy is passed in the future or not. Okay? So in the year immediately after levy failure, there's this huge percentage point increase, about 70 percentage points, in the probability of having a levy passed that following year, okay? Compared to districts where the levy initially fails. Okay, then it goes down over time and it kind of bumps up again after year 6. Part of the reason for that is that kind of the modal length of these levies is 5 years. We haven't fully exploited that. An interesting thing to look at in the future. Okay, so kind of future access to the ballot box is really important. Kind of, we think, the key mechanism for understanding why the uncertainty over a longer period of time goes down. Okay, how these districts are able to catch up. Okay. All right. So it's not just kind of from a policy perspective and looking at how these things affect outcomes that we actually care about. It's not necessarily clear that the revenue has a binding effect on what the district actually does. Okay. So if districts are saving, if they can borrow in capital markets, things like that, they might be able to smooth out a lot of the uncertainty in revenue for their actual operations and expenditures. Okay, so now let's look at, instead of having revenue as their outcome of interest, let's look at total expenditures. Okay, and what we see is that these revenue shocks actually do have a binding effect in the magnitude of money that the local school district spends. Okay, so all the way, and these effects are actually a little even more long-lived. Magnitude's a little bit smaller than the revenue shocks, but same idea. Okay, so years 1 through 4, pretty big expenditure effects. Years 5 and 6, they start to catch up to districts where the levy initially passed. Okay, we can also use this kind of analysis to try to say something about the priorities of school districts. Okay, so not just how much money do they spend, but how do they, does the allocation of expenditures across different line items in the budget, different categories of expense, does it change? Okay, so might be able to say something about the priorities of districts. I'm just going to break this down into 5 different categories. So building support expenditures, we see important negative effects, years 1 through 3. By year 4, no longer statistically distinguishable from 0. Instructional expenditure, we see negative effects. The important thing to keep in mind for this is the largest line item in the budget, the largest expenditure category that we see. So as a percentage, it's actually smaller than building support, but still important. Pupil support, which is a much smaller expenditure category, you kind of see consistently that this is something that districts are cutting in response to levy failure. Okay. And then we can also say something about when, what do districts think is so important? What do they value that they don't cut it when levies fail? Okay, so the effects on administrative expenditures are really very precisely estimated around 0. Okay, so no meaningful effects here. Staff support, very similar story. Okay, so for whatever reason, staff support and administrative expenditures are things that don't move in response to these levy failures. Okay. So I think here, if we want to tell a really political story, it would be really nice to say something about. Okay. All right. So the last kind of important policy outcome that I just want to talk about a little bit is the student achievement effect. Okay. So kind of the dominant literature in economics finds that expenditures have pretty small effects, if any effect, on student achievement. There's some dispute about this, but I think most people kind of think that the expenditure effects are small, if anything. So Eric Hanishek has made this point in various places. So here we're going to look at a measure of value added. Okay, what does the district add on average to student test score outcomes and estimate that treatment effect for levy failure on that outcome. Okay, so these are value-added scores. The average value-added score for Ohio school districts, estimated by the Ohio Department of Education, pretty big standard errors, not very precisely estimated. Part of that is we only have these data for fewer years than our other outcomes. But in years 2 and 3, you do see a measurable negative effect of levy failure on the average value added in the district. Okay, so this measure of student learning. Okay, by year 4, not much going on there. Okay, so this is a small effect, but a measurable one. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is kind of, can we resolve this puzzle? So if most people think that expenditures don't have much of an effect on student achievement outcomes, what could be going on here? Well, one reason is that this is kind of a very special case of an expenditure shock. Okay, so it's pretty different from the average expenditure shock that might exist in an educational setting. So there might be a lot of disruption induced in the school district and how it governs when a levy fails compared to some other change in expenditure. Okay, so there's some recent work looking at how things like teacher attrition, turnover affects student learning. Okay, so in the next slide, I'm just going to show some very suggestive, not great evidence that teacher attrition might be one explanation for what's going on and the effect in terms of student achievement. Okay, so not precisely estimated at all, but we do see some evidence that teacher attrition goes up when you have levy failure compared to places where these tax referenda pass. Okay, again, very suggestive and speculative, but what might be one possible mechanism for why expenditures seem a little bit more important in this context than in kind of the average economics of education study. Okay. All right, so just wrapping up quick. I went over my allotted time. Sorry about that. The key kind of idea here is that uncertainty in this policy domain of educational politics is important. It has short-run consequences. Over the long run, districts, political jurisdictions can adjust. Okay, and the mechanism that they can do that is you have future access to the ballot box. Okay, so kind of the way that direct democracy works in the United States, with districts, political jurisdictions having the ability to revisit in the future, to try again, kind of smooths out some of that long-term uncertainty that's induced by direct democracy. Okay, so I'll end it there. I'm very happy to take all your questions.